mean I'll see it.
I never really believed those stories about the deep woods until I actually spent time out there. You know, the ones where people just vanish, or they find something that looks human but just isn't. I grew up in the city, surrounded by the constant hum of traffic and the orange glow of streetlights that never let the darkness actually settle. But some friends and I decided to rent this place way out in the sticks, a cabin that was supposed to be the perfect off-the-grid getaway. Looking back, being off the grid is just another way of saying nobody is going to hear you when things go wrong. The drive up was fine, but as soon as we stepped out of the car, the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a gradual thing. One minute we were laughing over a podcast, and the next, we were standing in a silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing against our eardrums. The skyscrapers were gone, replaced by these towering, ancient pines with thick, dark bark that looked like charred skin. And it was quiet. Not the peaceful quiet you read about in travel brochures, but a dead silence. There was no chirping, no wind rustling the needles, no insects buzzing in the dirt. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for us to notice we didn't belong there. We spent the first few hours just hauling gear inside. My friend Mark was trying to be the outdoorsy one, checking the perimeter and making jokes about bear safety, but I could tell he was on edge too. He kept looking over his shoulder, squinting into the dense thicket of trees that crowded the back of the cabin. The sun started to dip, casting these long, jagged shadows that seemed to stretch toward the porch like fingers. By the time the moon came up, the fireflies started to flicker. That's when the whistling began. At first, I thought it was Mark or maybe one of the others just messing around. It was a high, melodic sound, almost like a nursery rhyme you can't quite place, but it was coming from deep within the trees. It would start in one spot, then suddenly sound like it was coming from behind us. We all stopped talking at once. We stood on that porch, staring into the blackness of the woods, and the whistling just grew louder. It was piercing, a sharp, clean sound that didn't belong in the wild. The fireflies were pulsing in rhythm with the sound, and for a split second, a group of them lit up a patch of shadow about 20 feet away. My heart didn't just drop, it felt like it stopped. I saw something standing there. Whatever it wasn't something God would have bothered creating. It had the general shape of a person, a tall, spindly figure, but the limbs were all wrong. They were elongated, stretching down past where its knees should have been, and they were bent at these horrific, unnatural angles, like the bones had been shattered and reset by someone who didn't know how a body worked. It had this pale, sickly skin that looked like wet parchment stretched over a cage of ribs. And the head, it was perfectly round, totally hairless, and dominated by these two sunken, milky eyes that didn't seem to have pupils. But the mouth was the worst part. It was a wide, gaping maw pulled back into a permanent, frozen grin that showed rows of needlepoint teeth, yellowed and jagged. I couldn't move. I couldn't even breathe. The thing just stood there, staring at me with those dead eyes, and then it let out that whistle again. It didn't come from its throat, it came directly from that open, grinning mouth, vibrating through the air until I could feel it in my teeth. It started to move, not walking, but a sort of skittering, jerky crawl that was way too fast for something that size. Run, I managed to choke out. Get inside. No. We scrambled for the door, tripping over each other in a blind panic. I was the last one in, and as I slammed the heavy wooden door, I felt something hit the other side. Not a shoulder or a hand, but a wet, heavy thud, followed by the sound of long, sharp nails dragging down the wood. The scratching was rhythmic, deliberate. We bolted every lock, pushed the heavy kitchen table against the frame, and huddled in the center of the main room. We didn't turn on the lights. We were too afraid of what we might see through the windows. For a long time, there was nothing but our own ragged breathing. Then the sound changed. It wasn't at the door anymore. We heard it on the roof. Heavy, wet thumps, like someone was dropping bags of raw meat onto the shingles. Then the scratching started up there, too. It sounded like dozens of them, or maybe just one that could move with impossible speed. They were circling us, testing the vents, digging at the chimney. And the whole time, that whistling never stopped. It was coming from all directions now, a chorus of high-pitched, mocking melodies that seemed to be laughing at how trapped we were. Mark was sitting on the floor, clutching a kitchen knife so hard his knuckles were white. He looked at me, and his face was completely drained of color. He whispered that he'd seen something through the small window in the pantry before we blocked it. He said he saw a hand, or what looked like a hand. It had 6 fingers, each one almost a foot long, and the tips were stained a deep, crusty crimson. He said the thing had been holding something. A piece of clothing. It looked like the flannel shirt of the guy who owned the cabin, the one who was supposed to meet us here but never showed up. That was the moment the true crime reality of it hit me. This wasn't just some ghost story or a weird animal. This thing, whatever it was, had been here for a long while. It knew the layout. It had been watching the road. It had hunted before. The night dragged on for what felt like years. Every time we thought it had left, a new sound would start. At one point, there was a wet, tearing noise from the porch, followed by a low, guttural slurping sound. It felt visceral, like we could actually smell the metallic tang of blood through the cracks in the walls. I kept imagining the creature out there, hunched over something, its needle teeth tearing through muscle and sinew, its pale eyes fixed on the door, waiting for us to break. Near dawn, the whistling finally tapered off. The woods went back to that suffocating silence. We didn't leave the cabin until the sun was high in the sky, and even then, we ran for the car without looking back. I wish I could say that was the end of it. I wish I could say that we called the police and they found some guy in a mask, or even just nothing at all. But when we got to the car, we saw the truth. The entire driver's side of the vehicle was covered in handprints. Not human ones. They were long, spindly marks made in a thick, dark substance that had dried in the morning heat. And stuck to the door handle was a single, jagged tooth, thin as a needle and sharp enough to draw blood when Mark touched it. I moved back to the city the next week. I sold most of my stuff and found an apartment on the 20th floor where the street noise is constant and the lights never go out. I thought I'd be safe here. But a few nights ago, the power went out in my building. The whole block went dark. I sat there in the pitch black, waiting for the backup generators to kick in. And then, from the hallway, just outside my front door, I heard it. A soft, high-pitched whistle. A melody I recognized from the pines. It's still here. It followed the sound of my heart, and it's just waiting for the lights to stay off long enough to finish what it started in the woods. I think you should keep your windows locked tonight. Honestly. Because once you hear that whistle, it means it's already found you. And it doesn't just want to kill you. It wants to take you apart, piece by piece, just to see how you're put together. I actually went back and did some digging after that night at the cabin. I couldn't just let it go. You know how it is when something breaks your brain, you start obsessing over the details because you're trying to find a logical exit ramp that doesn't exist. I ended up finding out about the guy who owned the place, the one who never showed up to give us the keys. His name was Thomas. He'd lived in that county his whole life, a guy who knew every trail, every creek, and every hollow in those woods. People said he was the kind of man who could track a deer through a thunderstorm. He wasn't some city amateur like us. He was a survivor. Or at least, he was supposed to be. From what I gathered from the local police reports and some whispered stories in the nearby town, things started getting weird for Thomas about a month before we arrived. He'd been staying at the cabin to do some repairs, mostly fixing the porch and clearing out some of the overgrowth that was starting to choke the foundations. He told a neighbor at the general store that the woods felt crowded. That was the word he used. Not quiet, not empty, crowded. He said the deer had stopped moving through the valley and the local stray dogs wouldn't go within a mile of the property line. It started with the small things. Thomas was a hunter, and he started finding kills near the creek bed. But they weren't the kind of kills a wolf or a cougar makes. He found a large buck one morning, draped over a high branch about 15 feet off the ground. The thing's legs had been snapped and twisted together like someone was trying to braid the bones. There was no meat taken, just the organs, removed with what looked like surgical precision, though the ribcage had been pried open so hard the sternum was shattered into white splinters. Thomas thought it was some sicko, some local prick playing out a twisted fantasy. He actually started carrying his rifle everywhere, even when he went to the outhouse. He was convinced he was being hunted by a man. But as the days went by, the true crime aspect of it shifted into something much more visceral and wrong. He wrote in a journal they found later. Most of it was just gibberish about the whistling man in the pines. He described how the silence would descend every evening at dusk, a heavy, suffocating blanket that seemed to kill the sound of his own footsteps. Then the whistling started for him, too. It wasn't just a noise. He described it as a physical sensation, like a vibration inside his skull. He'd be sitting at the kitchen table, the same one we pushed against the door, and he'd hear that high, melodic trill coming from the roof. He'd go outside with a flashlight, swinging the beam wildly into the dark, but he'd only catch glimpses. A flash of pale, hairless skin. A limb that looked like a stripped branch, bending at an angle that made his stomach turn. The night it finally happened, the night he stopped being the hunter, was probably the same week we booked the trip. He'd been trying to leave. He packed his bags and thrown them into his truck, but when he went to start the engine, he realized the wires hadn't just been chewed by rodents. They had been pulled out and organized. He found them laid out on the gravel in a perfect, geometric pattern, red, blue, and black wires arranged like a ritualistic sigil. That was when he heard the whistle from the driver's side window. According to the blood patterns the forensics team found much later, Thomas didn't even make it back to the porch. He was dragged. There were these long, deep furrows in the dirt where his fingers had clawed for grip, trying to hold onto the earth as something pulled him toward the tree line. The police found clumps of his hair snagged on the rose bushes, and the amount of blood on the gravel suggested that whatever had him didn't care about keeping him intact. The worst part of the report, the part that keeps me up at night, was the description of the processing. They found his flannel shirt, the one Mark saw later, discarded near the creek. It wasn't torn like it had been caught in a struggle. It had been unbuttoned. Every single button was gone, neatly bitten off, and the shirt was laid out flat on a rock, soaked in so much blood it looked like heavy leather. They eventually found what was left of Thomas in a hollowed-out cedar tree about half a mile from the cabin. I'm telling you, this part is gut-wrenching. He wasn't just dead. He'd been rearranged. The creature, or whatever those things are, had taken his limbs and forced them into the same unnatural angles we saw on that thing in the woods. His arms were snapped at the elbows and tucked behind his shoulder blades, and his legs had been broken and folded upwards so his heels were touching his collarbones. He was still wearing his boots. They were the only things that looked normal. The rest of him was a horrific puzzle of exposed muscle and shattered white bone. His jaw had been unhinged, stretched wide, and his mouth was filled with small, sharp stones, as if the thing was trying to mimic the shape of its own jagged teeth. The coroner said he might have been alive for the first hour of the reconstruction. Can you imagine that? Lying there in the dark, feeling your bones being snapped like dry kindling while that whistling sound echoed in your ears? The local cops tried to play it off as a cult killing or a freak animal attack, but they couldn't explain the whistling. 2 of the responding officers ended up quitting the force a week later. One of them told a friend that while they were bagging the remains, they heard a whistle coming from the canopy above them. They looked up and saw nothing but the swaying pines, but they felt like they were being watched by 1,000 eyes that didn't have pupils. And here's the thing that really gets me. After we left, the cabin was cleaned up and put back on the market by Thomas's estate. Some developer bought it, probably thinking they could flip it for a profit. But when the contractors went in to do the work, they found something Thomas had hidden under the floorboards in the bedroom. It was a collection. It wasn't money or jewelry. It was a pile of human teeth. Hundreds of them. Some were old and yellowed, others were fresh, still slick with bits of pink tissue. They were all sorted by size and sharpness. It turns out that property has a history of disappearances going back to the late 1800s. Every few decades, a family or a traveler would just vanish, and the locals would blame the terrain or the weather. But it wasn't the weather. It was the residents. Those things have been there for a long time, carving out a territory and practicing their art on whoever is unlucky enough to wander into the silence. They don't just kill for food, they kill to create. They see the human body as raw material, something to be twisted and bent until it matches the horror of their own existence. I think about Thomas a lot. I think about him sitting in that cabin, hearing the scratching on the roof and realizing that his rifle didn't mean a damn thing against something that could move like a shadow. I think about him looking at his flannel shirt and realizing it was the last thing he'd ever owned before he became a project for those needle-toothed things. I wonder if he's still out there in some way. Not his ghost, but his pieces. I wonder if those things are still wearing his skin or using his bones to build something even worse. Because the whistle I heard outside my apartment, it didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a man trying to scream through a throat that had been turned inside out. Be careful when you go out at night. Don't look for the source of the sound. Just keep moving, and for God's sake, don't ever go into a forest where you can't hear the birds. Because if the birds are quiet, it means they're listening to the same thing that's about to find you.
Next story.
I'm telling you this because I can't tell the police. Not yet. They're still looking for him, and every time I close my eyes, I see that house at the end of the gravel road. It's a normal-looking place, just a 2-story farmhouse with peeling white paint and a porch that looks like it's slowly sinking into the mud. My friend, Mike, asked me to help him clear it out after his great-uncle passed away. He said it was just a weekend job, some heavy lifting and throwing out old junk. We thought we'd find some old newspapers, maybe some vintage tools we could sell. We didn't expect to find what was waiting for us under the kitchen. The house smelled like damp wood and something else, something sweet and heavy, like fruit rotting in the sun. We spent the first few hours dragging old furniture to the porch. Mike was in a good mood, talking about what he'd do with the money once the land was sold. But the further we got into the house, the more the air seemed to thicken. It felt like the walls were leaning in, watching us work. By the time we got to the kitchen, the sun was starting to dip below the tree line, casting these long, jagged shadows across the linoleum. There was this heavy, hand-knotted rug under the kitchen table. It was filthy, stained with years of spilled coffee and grease. When we tried to pull it up, it wouldn't budge. It felt like it was stuck to the floor. We both grabbed a corner and pulled with everything we had. The sound it made when it finally ripped away was like skin peeling off a scab. Underneath, the floorboards weren't nailed down. They were loose, and there was a heavy iron ring bolted into a piece of plywood that had been cut into the shape of a hatch. Mike looked at me, and I could see the sweat beads on his forehead. He joked about finding hidden treasure, but his voice was thin. He pulled the hatch open. The smell that hit us wasn't just rot anymore. It was metallic, sharp. It burned the back of my throat and made my eyes water instantly. It was the smell of a slaughterhouse that had been closed for a decade. We used our phone flashlights to look down into the dark. It wasn't a basement. It was a crawl space, maybe 4 feet deep, lined with thick plastic sheets that were slick with a dark, oily substance. In the center of the space, there were these long, narrow duffel bags. They were stacked neatly, like cordwood. I counted 6 of them before I had to look away. They weren't just bags. They were wet. The canvas was soaked, through with something dark that hadn't quite dried yet. Mike reached down. I told him not to. I told him we should just leave, but he was already grabbing the zipper of the top bag. The sound of that zipper, it was the loudest thing I've ever heard in that silent house. It didn't glide. It hitched and stuttered as it caught on something inside. When it finally opened, Mike dropped his phone. It fell into the crawl space, the light bouncing off the plastic walls before landing face up, illuminating the contents of the bag. It wasn't a body. Not a whole one. It was a collection. I saw a hand first, but it had been meticulously cleaned. The skin was gone, leaving only the raw, red muscle and the white of the tendons. It looked like a medical model, except for the fact that it was sitting in a pool of dark, viscous fluid. Next to it was a face. Just the skin. It had been pinned to a piece of cardboard to keep its shape. The eyes were missing, just two ragged holes staring up at the kitchen ceiling. It looked like a mask, but the way the edges were frayed and bloody told me it had been taken while the person was still breathing. We didn't say a word. We just stood there, staring at this person's life reduced to a butcher's display. That's when we heard it. The front door, the one we'd left wide open to let the air in, creaked shut. Then the heavy, rhythmic thud of boots on the porch. Someone was walking toward the kitchen. They weren't rushing. They were walking like they lived there. Like they were coming home. We scrambled. There was no other way out of the kitchen except the back mudroom, but the door was locked from the outside. We had no choice. We dropped into that crawl space, sliding over the slick plastic and the heavy, wet bags. We pulled the plywood hatch shut just as the kitchen light flicked on. Through the narrow cracks in the floorboards, I could see his boots. They were yellow work boots, covered in dried mud and something that looked like rusted flakes of metal. He was heavy. Every step he took made the wood above our heads groan and flex. He walked right over to the hatch. I held my breath until my lungs felt like they were going to burst. I could see the tip of his boot resting right on the edge of the plywood. He stood there for what felt like hours. He was humming. It was a low, tuneless sound that vibrated through the floor and into my chest. Then I heard the sound of a chair being dragged across the floor. He sat down right on top of the hatch. The weight of him pressed the plywood down, pinning us into that small, foul-smelling space. Then came the scraping sound. It was rhythmic, methodical. He was sharpening a knife. I could hear the stone biting into the metal over and over again. Slink, slink, slink. Between the sounds of the whetstone, I heard him talk. He wasn't talking to us. He was talking to the bags. I knew you'd bring company, he whispered. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in years. New layers. New textures. I've been waiting for a reason to use the long blades. I looked at Mike. He was shaking so hard his teeth were chattering, but he was silent. We were lying on top of the bags now. I could feel the cold, soft lumps shifting beneath me. One of the bags wasn't closed all the way. I felt something wet and sticky brush against my arm. I didn't look. I knew if I looked, I would scream, and if I screamed, that hatch would open. Suddenly, the sharpening stopped. The house went deathly quiet. I could hear the man's breathing, heavy, wet, and labored. Then the chair scraped back. The weight lifted off the plywood. My heart hammered against my ribs so hard I thought he could hear it. But he didn't open the hatch. Instead, I heard him walk to the sink. He turned on the water. It ran for a long time. "I'll let you marinate," he said, his voice right above the floorboards. The fear makes the skin easier to slip. It tightens the fascia. Just a little longer. He walked out of the kitchen. We heard the front door open and close, but we didn't move. We stayed in that dark, suffocating hole for hours. We waited until the moon was high and the house was silent again. We pushed the hatch up inch by inch, terrified he was standing right there with the long blade he'd mentioned. The kitchen was empty, but on the table, right where he'd been sitting, was a single bloody Polaroid. It was a picture of me and Mike from 20 minutes before we entered the house. He'd been watching us from the woods the whole time. We ran. We didn't look back, didn't grab our stuff. We just ran through the woods until we hit the main road and flagged down a trucker. I haven't been back. Mike hasn't spoken a word since that night. He just sits in his room, staring at his hands. The police went out there the next day, but the house was empty. The hatch was gone. The floorboards were nailed down tight, and there was no crawl space. They told us we must have been hallucinating from the mold in the house, but they didn't see the Polaroid. I kept it, and every morning when I wake up, I check the back of it. Yesterday, a new line of text appeared on the back in black marker. It says, "I'm almost finished with the others. I'll be seeing you soon for the final fitting." I haven't slept since. I can still smell that rotting fruit. I can still feel the white canvas of those bags against my skin. He's out there, and he's not a ghost. He's just a man with a very sharp knife and a lot of empty bags to fill.
Next story.
I've spent a lot of time trying to convince myself that what I saw was just some kind of elaborate hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the stale air of those basement archives. But the scars on my forearms don't lie, and neither does the fact that I can't close my eyes in a dark room without seeing that pale, flickering shape in the corner of my vision. This isn't one of those stories where a ghost haunts a Victorian mansion. This is about a man who lived in the gaps of my life, quite literally, and what he was building in the dark while I thought I was alone. It started during that long stretch of months when I was working the night shift at the county records building. It was a miserable, windowless fortress built in the 70s, filled with miles of rolling metal shelves and the suffocating smell of decomposing paper. My job was simple enough. I had to digitize old property deeds and death certificates. Most nights, I was the only soul in the building, save for a security guard who usually spent his entire shift asleep in the lobby, 3 floors up. The first thing I noticed wasn't a sound or a sight, but a smell. It wasn't the usual musty scent of the archives. It was something sharper, more organic. It smelled like a butcher shop that had been closed for a week in the middle of a heat wave, a cloying, metallic sweetness that stuck to the back of my throat. I mentioned it to the facility manager, but he just blamed it on the old plumbing and told me to use more air freshener. About a month into the job, things started to go missing. Small things, a half-eaten sandwich from the break room fridge, a roll of heavy-duty packing tape, a pair of surgical scissors I used for delicate document repair. I figured it was just the security guard being forgetful or messing with me. Then I found the first gift on my desk. It was a small bird, a sparrow, but it had been altered. Its wings had been removed and sewn back onto its chest with what looked like dental floss. It was a crude, ugly piece of taxidermy, but the stitches were remarkably precise. I threw it in the trash, feeling a cold knot of nausea tighten in my stomach, assuming some sick teenager had found a way into the basement. That night, I decided to do a walkthrough of the entire floor. The archives were a labyrinth of narrow aisles and heavy steel cabinets. As I reached the back corner, a section of the basement that hadn't been touched in decades, I noticed one of the floor-to-ceiling shelves was slightly out of alignment. I pushed against it, expecting it to be bolted to the floor, but it slid back with a heavy, grinding groan. Behind the shelf was a maintenance crawl space that didn't appear on any of the floor plans I'd seen. The smell hit me instantly, that rotten copper stench, now so thick it felt like a physical weight. I should have turned back. I should have run to the lobby and woken the guard. But curiosity is a persistent, dangerous thing. I pulled my flashlight from my belt and stepped into the dark. The crawl space was low-ceilinged, forced me to hunch over. The walls were lined with damp insulation and tangles of rusted pipes. As I moved deeper, my light swept over a clearing in the center of the mess. There was a sleeping bag there, stained a dark, crusty brown. And around it were the projects. I saw dozens of them. Small animals, rats, pigeons, stray cats, all of them surgically dismantled and put back together in ways that defied nature. A cat with the head of a hawk sewn onto its neck. A rat with human-looking teeth glued into its gums. But it was the far wall that made my blood turn to ice. There were hundreds of photos pinned to the insulation. They were all of me. Photos of me walking to my car, photos of me eating lunch, and dozens of photos of me sleeping at my desk during my breaks. But the worst part, the part that still makes me want to scream, were the recreations. On a makeshift workbench sat a life-size torso. It was constructed out of old leather jackets and industrial foam, but it was covered in patches of something that looked horribly like human skin. It took me a moment to realize where the material had come from. Over the past few weeks, I'd been finding small, red marks on my arms and legs that I dismissed as bedbug bites or scratches from the metal shelves. Now, looking at that grotesque mannequin, I saw my own birthmarks. I saw a familiar mole on a patch of grayish, preserved flesh. He hadn't just been watching me. He'd been harvesting me. While I'd been nodding off at my desk, someone had been stepping out of the walls and carefully, surgically, taking small pieces of me to build a version of me that he could keep. I heard a wet, sliding sound behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the dark. At the end of the narrow passage, a figure was crouched like an insect. He was impossibly thin, his skin a translucent, sickly white that seemed to cling to his bones. He wasn't wearing clothes, just a patchwork garment made of the same grayish leather I'd seen on the workbench. He was holding my missing surgical scissors in one hand and a curved upholstery needle in the other. He didn't snarl or scream. He just looked at me with eyes that were wide, unblinking, and filled with a terrifying, obsessive sort of love. He started to move toward me, his limbs clicking in their sockets, his movements jerky and unnatural. Almost finished, he whispered. His voice sounded like dry leaves scraping against pavement. Just need the eyes. I need the windows. I didn't think. I swung my heavy industrial flashlight with everything I had. It caught him across the side of his head, and I felt the sickening crunch of bone and the splash of something warm and sticky hitting my face. He slumped to the side, but he didn't fall. He just hissed and lunged for my legs. I scrambled back, kicking at his face, feeling my boots sink into soft, yielding tissue. I managed to squeeze back through the gap behind the shelving unit and shoved the heavy rack back into place with a burst of panicked strength. I didn't stop running until I was out of the building, screaming for the guard, who was still slumped in his chair, oblivious. By the time the police arrived and tore that shelf away, the crawl space was empty. They found the sleeping bag, the photos, and the horrifying mannequin, but the skin stitcher was gone. They found a secondary exit through an old coal chute that led to the alleyway behind the building. The investigation went on for months, but they never found him. They told me he was likely a transient with severe mental health issues, someone who had developed a fixation. They tried to downplay the surgical aspect, but I saw what was on that workbench. I know what he was doing. I moved 3 states away. I changed my name. I work in a bright, open-concept office now, surrounded by people at all times. But every now and then, I'll find something that shouldn't be there. A small, neat pile of hair clippings on my bedside table. A missing button from my favorite shirt. A few nights ago, I woke up because I felt a sharp, stinging sensation on my heel. When I turned on the light, there was no one there. But when I looked down at my foot, there was a single, perfect stitch of black dental floss looped through my skin. He's still building. And he's getting closer to the finish line every single day.
Next story. next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.